Hey everybody, good day. Give us about 2 minutes. You were in the right room, and we will get started shortly. Thanks everybody for joining. Give us about 30 more seconds. We've still got a few more attendees coming in. I want to give everybody time. Hopefully you've got your lunch or your snack to keep from the afternoon lunch slump. All right, I think we are at what I'm going to call a critical mass. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really exciting to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. This is our 16th episode of When Things Go Wrong, and appropriately for this time of the year, it's our year-end review. And so we're going to do a little bit of reflecting on 2023, some of the biggest things that have happened in the industry and their impacts, and more importantly, how you can all use them and reflect on them to prepare for what's in store for 2024 as we continue to navigate this wild roller coaster that is the cannabis industry. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started here. Recordings. This webinar is being recorded, as all of ours have been. They're available on both our YouTube channel and on our website under publications. I believe I should know that off the top of my head, but they are all available there. This one will be uploaded within a few days as well, so be ready to share this with your friends and family and colleagues. Maybe a great little post-Christmas relaxation and reflection webinar. Questions and answers, we're here for you guys, right? This is for you, the participants in the audience. So we got some great submissions during the registration process, but if anything else comes up today, please use the Q&A function. You can submit anonymously if you'd like to, or not, and we will do our best to get to them throughout the webinar. We're 1 hour. Want to respect everybody's time and keep this digestible and manageable. So we're gonna get started. And with that, I want to hand it over to our newest employee of GMP Collective. Not new to the cannabis industry. I suspect some folks will remember her face and voice. Bethany, take it away.
Hello, welcome everybody. I am so happy to be the new moderator of When Things Go Wrong, where we discuss various challenges and issues within the cannabis industry with the aim of offering valuable insights, tips, and solutions based on our guest experts' experiences. As David mentioned, I've just joined the team at the GMP Collective as the Director of Content Strategy and Market Growth, and I am excited to continue working with brilliant and passionate experts in the cannabis and hemp industry. It's my first time hosting a webinar, but as many of you maybe know, I did host a podcast for many years, so hopefully it's just like riding a bike. So with that, let's dive right into the webinar. You all know David Vaillencourt, CEO of the GMP Collective, and co-founder of S3 Collective, as well as vice chair of the ASTM International Committee D37 on Cannabis. Joining David for today's panel discussion is Alena Rodriguez. She is the co-founder of the S3 Collective and is an expert on laboratory testing, quality management systems, and regulatory compliance. She's currently the chair of the laboratory subcommittee of the ASTM International Committee D37 on cannabis. So as we're wrapping up the year 2023, let's take a look back at some of the developments and progress being made in the cannabis and hemp industry. So let's start with the discussion around rescheduling cannabis. The DEA is considering scheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 in the Controlled Substances Act. This is kind of a big deal on a lot of fronts, and this could have many implications at both the federal and state level. So, Alena, what are your reactions to that, and what are some pros and cons to that?
So I would say my, initial and biggest reaction is that this is such a pivotal moment in our industry. I mean, for 53 years, cannabis has been on Schedule 1, which means it has no medical value in the United States and a high potential for misuse. And obviously, if we reschedule to a lower schedule status of 3, that, the FDA's recommendation in going to that Schedule 3 was the first time in 53 years that a leading federal government agency admitted that cannabis has medicinal value. And that's not the only thing they admitted. They admitted that it has a lower misuse potential than that of opiates, such as morphine and codeine. So I think that's super huge. Schedule 3 indicates that there's a moderate to low potential for psychological or physical dependence. And I would say that this is a really important time to stay apprised on what's going on with this rescheduling process, because there is probably going to be a public comment period that comes up. So while, we're still waiting on the DEA to announce their decision, they are bound to the FDA's recommendation on scientific and medical issues. So, but we still are far from this process. We have to have the DEA draft rules, then there's a public comment period. There's probably going to be people who are going to request administrative law judge hearings, the final rule, and then we have judicial review. So we're a long way away from this, but it is an important time to stay apprised of what's going on. Obviously, one of the biggest pros to rescheduling to Schedule 3 would be that the 280E tax provision becomes a non-issue, which will increase cannabis businesses' cash flow because they'll have a reduced tax rate and finally be able to take those normal business deductions. And I believe that increased cash flow will likely save a lot of struggling companies. And it can also be used to bolster quality systems that will be needed, once we get to that federal regulation stage. And I believe that, Schedule 3 will lead to expansion of medical cannabis markets in the states that maybe don't have it yet. I think it will increase pressure on federal agencies to develop federal guidelines. It becomes easier to conduct medical cannabis research if we're in Schedule 3. And another thing that I think is important is it allows doctors to discuss cannabis with their patients and offer it as a treatment. Rather than the situation they're in now, doctors are fearful that if they even mention cannabis, it could risk their own DEA registrations. So, and I also believe that rescheduling would signal to the criminal justice system that, cannabis is a lower priority. However, the cons, obviously it's not as progressive as most people in the industry want. They want a clean, deschedule, take us off the schedule, but it's a huge step in the right direction. And it's also important to note that rescheduling will not address social equity issues. It won't address banking issues. It also won't affect penalties for trafficking convictions. So that means that rescheduling cannabis without further action allows a lot of the harms caused by the war on drugs to continue. So that's something we need to think about when we move forward into 2024.
Those are some great insights. Thank you, Alena. David, what do you think? What are some of those implications of rescheduling at state, federal, global level?
Yeah, thanks, Bethany and Alena, for kind of opening up with a pretty comprehensive overview of the pros and cons. I can't believe it's been over a year now since we actually had Alena and Andrew Klein, one of our good friends and colleagues, on a previous episode of When Things Go Wrong, discussing, I believe that was within the first 2 or 3 weeks of Biden's announcement to initiate this administrative review process on rescheduling. Since then, a lot of discussions have happened. We got the FDA's, we got the notification the end of August that the Department of Health and Human Services, officially recommended Schedule 3 to the DEA. And so now as Alena mentioned, we're waiting for the DEA to issue its ruling or recommendation that will then kick off a limited window public comment period. And I can't stress how important that is, because getting to your question, Bethany, this is historic. And what I mean by that is in the context of what it sends as a message to the world. Since 1970, when the Controlled Substance Act was initiated, cannabis was placed in a category of Schedule 1, right? We all know that it was always intended to be reevaluated at a later point with scientific research. That never happened, right? There's been 4 times, mostly thanks to NORML or in groups with NORML, that led, whether it was a lawsuit or another, solicitation of a process to push for reconsideration of the scheduling. And all 4 times that failed. Last time was in 2016. And so here we are 7, almost 8 years later since the last attempt, where our protector of public health is now officially saying for the first time since the Controlled Substance Act was ever created that cannabis has medical and scientific value. Does it mean it's benign and not free of risks? Of course not. But is any product? Of course not. So when you think about the United Nations conventions, global policies, and how, we're ultimately, as the US, we're a strong global power. Our message and our voice carries a lot of weight in the world. And so for us to simply say that it is no longer a product with zero medical or scientific potential is huge. Yes, there is no doubt so much uncertainty this creates. After 12 years of, regulated marketplace in Colorado, and even longer if you go back to the Compassionate Use Act in California, we've finally gotten to a place where we're surviving with 280E, we're surviving within our state boundaries. And now, what does Schedule 3 mean? There's all sorts of uncertainty now that this has created, and nobody likes change. Change is definitely uncertain. But I'd say this is part of our growing pains, even if it was a descheduling, which for so many other reasons that experts like Andrew Klein and Shane Pennington, I would encourage you all to look up his blogs on Substack, can speak to, is highly unlikely and incredibly problematic if there were to have been a descheduling recommendation. And so, again, just thinking about the message that it means to the world to have a Schedule 3 recommendation, and that it's time for us to double down, like as an industry. The barriers will be lifted with a 280E restriction from a tax deduction to reinvest that into research on the safety, on the pros and cons, like every other company that deals with consumer products is required to do. This is the major opportunity, and it's not the end. It's just another baby step on this long journey of normalization of the cannabis industry. We've come a really long way, and these things don't happen overnight. So I know it's not easy to be patient, but if we can look at the positives of, rescheduling and the message it sends to the world, I think we're off to a really good start.
Yeah, that could be a big baby step. So, great. Thank you for the insights on that. It is kind of a big deal to wrap your head around. So next, in 2023, we saw further discussion on the debate around hemp, and it's a little bit confusing, at least for me. So David, could you break that down and explain what's happening with hemp?
I think it's confusing for everyone, even myself still, right? Like it's such a kerfuffle, and I'll actually kind of like play it off of the descheduling or the rescheduling initiative. If you think of 280E, what has now happened is, whether even in Colorado, which has kind of surprised me. I feel a little naive. The last time I walked into a hemp or smoke shop, or one of the first times, literally a few weeks ago, and I was like, could not believe how many THCA, HHC, and other products there were, because we have dispensaries everywhere, in our state. So this isn't just in Texas, Mississippi, and southern states, but all over the entire country now are products that do the same thing for all intents and purposes as state regulated medical cannabis products that, let's not forget, because of the Schedule 1, are taxed and don't, at a very high tax rate because of the 280E. So now there's a hemp marketplace based on the Farm Bill's interpretation that has allowed products that, based on Whitney Economics' last report, pegs the marketplace at something like $30 billion. That's larger than the combined sales of medical and adult use regulated state marketplace cannabis. So we now have a marketplace almost overnight that has zero regulatory oversight, right? Or I'd say zero with a caveat of yes, they are technically in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the FDA has issued warning letters around that, especially when label claims or other marketing materials have been made. But we have a major set of products that are consumer products that we have no safety data around. Delta 8 is only found as essentially a degradant in the plant product. Nobody has ever consumed Delta 8, Delta 10, or HHC in any of these quantities. We don't know what the safety profiles are of this, and that's a major risk to consumer safety. And that's honestly what keeps me up at night. I'm not a fan of prohibition. I think we're all here because we've fought against prohibition. That's why we're here as the cannabis industry. So I don't want to encourage anybody to go into a prohibition mindset, but we need minimum standards. We need minimum safety standards. And I see this as an amazing opportunity for the cannabis and the hemp industry, or however we want to call it, to come together and agree on minimum safety standards for product safety and testing that should be no different whether you're in Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, Massachusetts, or even throughout Canada. And we have the opportunity to do that as an industry. I think the time is of the essence, and it's really in our best interest, because for any of you that are here that may have been at MJ Biz and happened to catch the panel that I did with a team of 4 amazing women, we talked through from 1906 on the history of tragedies that have happened in America that have led to different congressional acts that have put very strict guardrails on the food and pharmaceutical industry because of major consumer health outbreaks. And how much would it suck, just to be blunt, if the cannabis industry ended up back in a state of prohibition because of unsafe, intoxicating hemp products running rampant that nobody wants to have on their shoulders, that responsibility. So I'll pause there. Maybe Alena has something else to add.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah, Alena, what would you add to that?
Well, the Farm Bill was supposed to be renewed this year, but we all know that it got extended to September 2024. And while some people probably are upset about that, I think it really provides a good opportunity for all of us to come together and collaborate as a collective cannabinoid-containing product industry, right? To not think of it as cannabis versus hemp, but we are all creating products that contain cannabinoids. And there's obviously various opinions on how to improve upon the loopholes that exist in the 2018 Farm Bill, right? But the way that we can collectively come together is to find consensus solutions that realize the safety and quality implications on this flourishing and largely unregulated intoxicating cannabinoid market. So, we do know that other industries have dealt with this. Other fast-growing industries have had this crossroads where they're like, wow, we have so many competitors in the space, so many diverse opinions on what's the right best practice and things like that. So there's a tried and true way that all these other industries for over 100 years have worked through these kinds of problems, and that's using consensus standards development organizations like ASTM. So just to provide a few examples, I think of other industries that had a crossroads and they got through it and they were able to have a seat at the table of the regulations they follow is the steel industry. And so in the early 20th century, that was a very fast growing industry, just like we have right now in our industry. There was a lack of standardized methods for testing and for specifying materials, and that was leading to frequent rail breaks and causing deaths. And so that was one of the reasons why ASTM, one of the leading standards development organizations, was founded in 1898, and they played a pivotal role in developing those standardized methods for steel, and they published their first standard on how to manufacture steel rails safely in 1901. So those standards that the steel industry created for themselves, they helped ensure consistency and quality and performance across the country. And that over time led the federal government bodies, including the US military, to adopt those ASTM standards and regulation. So Another example is the food industry. So back before the 1960s, the food industry relied heavily on that final product testing to ensure safety. You know, that's what we do now in the cannabis industry. And that wasn't always effective. There was still foodborne illness happening. So that caused the food industry to develop a hazard analysis and critical control points, which is known as HACCP. It's a system that revolutionized the way we think about food safety, and it was a preventative approach rather than a reactive approach to food safety. And eventually regulatory agencies such as the FDA and the USDA mandated that you needed to use HACCP for various segments of the food industry. So those are just a couple examples of, how other industries, we're at a crossroads, probably divided like we are hemp versus cannabis and a lot of these issues. And they came together, they saw the value of, we need to just come together and create these minimum standards. Everybody can go beyond that, but just the minimum standards. And then the government comes in and says, hey, those standards that you're creating looks like they're working. People are, safer than they were without them. So let's just adopt them, So that's what the goal would be, as we move towards federal regulation in our cannabinoid containing product industry.
Yeah, absolutely. The right amount of regulations for public safety is where we're going. Yeah. And that segues really nicely into the next topic I wanted to bring up, the world of ASTM standards, where the GMP Collective is firmly seated at the table, participating in the ASTM D37 Committee on Cannabis, where dozens of standards ranging from cannabis facility sanitation to security and transportation, they're all covered. So Alena, you're very involved in ASTM Cannabis Committee, including serving as the chair of the laboratory subcommittee. So what new developments here would you like to mention?
So when I joined D37 2018, we had 2 standards on water activity. And today we have 53 published standards that range across the sectors of the industry. So a lot of times when we speak about standards, people just go directly to test methods. Standards, it must all be about testing, right? Well, that's not the case at D37. We have about a dozen subcommittees that range across different sectors of the industry. And Bethany, if you go pull up that slide, we have shorthand listed the topics of the 53 published standards, just to give a few examples. We have a few standards actually that are listed on the screen that have been adopted by different states. So Nevada's Cannabis Compliance Board adopted ASTM 8282, which is the standard practice for laboratory test method validation. So all of their cannabis labs have to use this ASTM standard to validate the test methods they use for compliance testing. And then recently, Colorado's Marijuana Enforcement Division adopted ASTM D8250, which is the standard practice for applying a HACCP program for cannabis consumable products. So starting next year, cultivators can actually reduce their testing costs if they implement a HACCP system based on this ASTM standard. And some of other standards I could just pull from the screen is we have 2 that were actually published this year that are pretty important. I think there's a standard specification for labeling cannabis products. So if you think of how easy it is to understand a nutrition label when you go pull something off a grocery shelf, that standard hopefully will address all the various labeling practices across the country. And then another one that I'd like to highlight that was published this year was a standard guide on how to homogenize and subsample cannabis flower samples for laboratory analysis. So there are, just many examples of standards we published so far, and there's about 75, I believe, other standards that are in the works at D37 right now. And if you could go to the next slide, I just wanted to also bring up, we've created a comparison of CANRA's committees. So CANRA has all these committees listed on the left, and we did this exercise of comparing CANRA's committees to D37 subcommittees. And I think it highlights the fact that the standards that we're working on at D37 directly complement the issues and topics that CANRA, which is the Regulators Association of Cannabis Regulators from 45 states, they're focusing on these topics, and D37 is trying to create standards directly related to these topics.
Great. Thank you for that, Alena. Great chart. So David, you're the vice chair of the ASTM Cannabis Committee. What are your thoughts around the world of ASTM?
Yeah, obviously I've drank the Kool-Aid of the ASTM process because of everything Alena said, right? Starting with the railroad example, like this is where challenging problems facing, major credibility of industries from railroads to playgrounds to roller coasters have been able to come together with regulators, with consumer advocacy groups, and with commercial interests in a fair and balanced process. Which, God, why is that word? Why does fair and balanced bring off my tongue so easily? But that aside, to make sure that there is a framework that allows global marketplaces to operate, allows businesses to innovate, and protects consumer safety. Like that's what the framework is. ASTM is 125 years old, and it's one of many standards development organizations, SDOs, that are accredited to meeting the World Trade Organization's principles on trade. So folks see Underwriters Laboratories, UL is a common one on pretty much like every household electronic you might see. Pick up your Sharpie markers or your or dry erase markers. You'll see, conforms to ASTM D4236. These are basic standards that allow our society to work, and it's really exciting to see more and more of the industry come together and roll up our sleeves through ASTM's committee. And a couple of things I want to add, based on following up on Canra and what you mentioned there, like I want to put this out as a challenge to the industry. My assessment at this point is that the regulators are more organized than the cannabis industry, and I say that especially when you look at the nexus and the civil war, for lack of a better term, between the cannabis, high THC, and the hemp industry. There is a major identity crisis going on of like, who do we stand for? What are those minimum standards? Until we come together with our competitors and say, for the best interest of our industry and credibility that we have fought so hard to get towards, what are those minimum standards or shared set of rules? Think of them as a shared set of rules that we can all agree to, that we can work with the regulators and say, this is what we want. I mean, that's literally, as Alena said, what happened in Colorado this year through the Science and Policy Group. The industry brought HACCP forward as an ASTM standard. And to see a consensus standard that was developed 4 years ago be put through the process and evaluated by the industry stakeholders and by the regulators and say, yeah, this will work. That's the power that we have. And so I'm just really excited to see our next meeting coming up in January. We meet twice a week in person. If you haven't already booked your plane ticket, come to Louisville. It's going to be fun. Louisville, Kentucky. It'll be my first time there in January 21st to the 24th. And it's really that opportunity again to just roll up your sleeves. And the last thing I want to say on ASTM as well in our engagement is some of the pushback I've gotten from folks, which I think is amazing when this is the problem they say is, well, and this has come from both labs and industry commercial operators is, well, look, I have a commercial interest. I don't want to, influence what I think is best. And, that like, cause that starts getting into lobbying, right? And it's like, that's actually what the ASTM process is designed to do. If you don't have a voice at the table and say, what's an accepted tolerance for THC relative to label claims? Is it 15%? If you're a lab and the analytical capabilities better than Bethany would as a non-lab expert, as a non-operator, and better than even a commercial operator, licensed producer, large MSO or otherwise, you need to be able to influence and share that knowledge, just as the cultivator needs to say, hey, this is a heterogeneous plant. I can't meet this range either, and we can work together to come up with what that needs to be. And that's what the process provides. So bring your commercial interests, bring your objectives, but and bring your voice to the table, more importantly, because the ASTM process allows for appropriate balance of commercial interests. It's one vote, one interest, one vote, and that becomes so powerful as the industry grows. Because the last analogy I'll say is, think about the oil and gas industry, BP, Chevron, common names, they show up at the table. At the end of the day, they get one vote. So 1 vote per company. And so that's a really powerful check and balances system. And I really want to just continue to encourage folks to get involved at ASTM and, with other standards organizations. Obviously, there's AOAC on the lab side, and US Pharmacopoeia has their technical expert committee framework as well. These are great organizations that are leading the charge. Come get involved.
Super exciting. I am looking forward to being in Kentucky for the first time as well for committee week in January. So that was a good review of some of the big things that happened in 2023. What a year. So as we look forward and we turn the calendar page, we get a whole new calendar. Let's take a look at the upcoming year, 2024. So generally speaking, before we get into more specifics, overall, what should cannabis operators look out for, and how can they avoid things going wrong? Hence the theme of this webinar, especially impacting those 3 topics that we just covered from 2023: rescheduling, hemp, and standards. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think back to the uncertainty that Schedule 3's recommendation has created in the marketplace and the concerns, as well as the, intoxicating hemp marketplace and the lack of minimum standards. And, think back to the table on that first slide that you shared, Bethany, right, with Alena talking about, here's 53 standards. ASAP's one of them. There's a lab validation standard that Nevada has in their laws. Look at those. There's complaints, how to build a quality management system. If you're an operator and not a member, again, become a member. It's $115 a year, and that gives you access to all those standards. And as you're developing or improving your processes, because nobody's perfect out the gate, I still make mistakes every day because I'm also human. Operators are no different. Take those standards, look at them, and start incorporating them into your system. This is low-hanging fruit. You don't have to come up with what's the best way to implement a CAPA system or a QMS. The guidance is there already. And if you see an area where there's opportunity for improvement and you want to, you have an idea that maybe could improve the benchmark, take out a revision, and you can drive the improvement of those standards as the minimum and establish your company as the gold standard with meeting those minimum requirements. And allow your competitors to challenge and raise the bar, right? Like, I think that's the easiest way that folks can get involved and take advantage of resources to give themselves an edge in sustainability into 2024 and beyond. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, Alena, I'll let you pick up from here.
Well, obviously, I think we should all be looking out for legalization because it's on the horizon. It's gaining traction. The first time the Gallup polls, asked people about whether they favored legalization back in 1969, only 12% of people said they favored it. The polls from this year say that 70% of US adults, think that cannabis should be legal. So, and also with FDA's August recommendation of Schedule 3, I just think that, legalization is coming and we all need to prepare for that. And that means some sort of federal regulation, which will likely include, the use of good manufacturing practices, quality management systems, and other bare minimum standards that have been used in other industries to ensure safety and quality of consumable products. And I also feel like, we are just getting more innovative and creative as an industry. There's just so many products out there. So I think, as we have further product diversification and further innovation, we should also be looking out for how can we increase, as individual businesses, how can we all increase our focus on research, on using CGMPs, because we are going to need to characterize our products. We are going to need standardized terminology. We're going to need standardized cultivation and processing methods. And all of that feeds into consumer education. It's incredibly difficult when I talk to my friends and family, even though I'm, in the industry, when I try to explain to them the difference between Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10, they get so confused and they don't understand how to read labels, and, I've gone into hemp shops and picked up pre-rolls that are CBD pre-rolls that nowhere on the label says CBD or hemp. That's very it's very challenging for consumers and patients to navigate. So I think, as an industry, we all need to also, work on how we're going to educate consumers and patients. And we also need to look out for, centralized supply chain management and being able to have trusted and verified supply chain management. Has been an issue in our industry for years. And we, do need to continue those social equity initiatives. Like I mentioned before, this rescheduling isn't going to touch that. We're going to need other actions to touch that. So I think we're going to need to work on that and continue working on accessibility and mitigating high prices, not only for businesses, to buy their supplies to create their products, but also mitigating those high prices for consumers and patients as well, which is obviously a balance we have to strike when we set standards, right?
Well said. I want to jump in off of that because you just inspired me of a couple of things, if I didn't already lose my train of thought here. If you think about back to, preparing for federal legalization, and let's just use the concept back to what Alena said around supply chains, like to trust a product, whether you're a consumer or a company buying, 55 pounds or pallets of sugar or biomass, requires trust, right? And we go to the grocery store or the convenience store, we don't think about, are those Kellogg's, is that Kellogg's cereal safe for me to buy? Is it okay for my kid? It's been approved. It's in a regulated supply chain, regardless of the, perfections or imperfections of regulatory oversight and self-regulation that happens in every industry with that balance. We don't have that in the cannabis industry. And why don't we have that? Because we don't have those minimum standards and shared set of rules. Like what are the, we have final product testing, and we have limits there that I don't think anybody likes. Like literally either they're too stringent or they're missing and they're not consistent across the entire country. What is the acceptable amount of microbial contamination? And can pesticides be allowed in trace elements above a couple 100 million, parts per million? Those are basic questions that, the rest of the world has figured out and will continue to evolve as, new pesticides, new threats of invasive species, et cetera, are, introduced or, evolve. So we need to stay on top of that from an innovation standpoint, just as much as we need to, invest in innovative products, because innovative products are totally cool. Like it's amazing to see what exists in the marketplace today that wasn't around even 5 years ago. But we need to make sure we're asking the right questions and mitigating our risks. And, the last thing I'll say about that is, like, if you think back to the standards process, think of it as the ultimate peer review and peer feedback process. And to be your own lab or your own company and be like, is this product safe or is this limit okay? You've got 15 of your colleagues there with technical expertise and regulators, toxicologists that can chime in quickly and have answers to these questions that you might spend thousands of dollars trying to research or commission that they might already have answers to. So it's the best way to develop scientifically based, valid standards that help your business and help your liability and help the industry.
Yeah. We've discussed this in my previous podcast many times about how getting ahead of federal legalization requires us to regulate from the inside before the regulators come tell us what to do. So more on standards, we've mentioned that ASTM Committee Week is coming up in mid to late January in Kentucky. So who's going to be there? The whole cannabis industry? Is everyone on this webinar booking their flights right now?
Hopefully, if they haven't already. The three of us are coming. I know that much, right? And I know I started to answer, a bit about, or share a bit about, January. It's the 21st to the 24th. There's an amazing sensory evaluation workshop that it's another committee that does sensory evaluation, develops sensory evaluation standards for lotions, fragrances, other consumer products. It's actually hosting that for a half day, which I'm really excited about. They came to us as a committee and said, this is important. Everybody talks about the aroma and the quality attributes of cannabis. So now we've got a half day workshop hosted by them to discuss the expertise and nerd out. I don't think there'll be any consumption. That I'm pretty sure it's not ASTM sanctioned, but to be able to actually dive into the aromatic profiles is going to be so much fun. You know, regulators attend. We've had NIST at the table, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which facilitates all the government engagement on standards. They've been there. It's actually Alena's vice chair on the lab subcommittee. Health Canada, I know, will be doing some virtual stuff. They're not able to attend in person, but they've been active. They're on our executive committee. We average about 100 folks. We have consultants that work for the industry. We have security and transportation. We have labs. We have licensed producers. We have trade associations. Ideally, the answer would be, yeah, Bethany, everybody on this attendee list and anybody that has a vested interest in the cannabis industry would be there, because that's the place where, as a couple of colleagues have said, this is where the work gets done. This is where the real technical experts are and the conversations happen. It's a fun process to argue with a spirited, framework on what best practices should be. And it's about driving decisions. It's not talking to talk. We are forced to make decisions, and that's what we need.
This will be a great experience for me for my first time there. Alena, what are you looking forward to doing at the meeting and in 2024 surrounding ASTM Standards Development?
So sorry if my dog's barking a little bit in the background, but so for January, we put together quite a schedule with tons of topics of task groups and standards we're going to actually roll up our sleeves and start working on. I wanted to highlight a few of them to maybe get some of you interested in coming. But one of our subcommittees, the strategic planning subcommittee, has been on a project for a while to forecast for the next 5 years what standards we should be developing in D37. And so during January, we're going to have a joint task group with both the strategic planning subcommittee and then our government liaison subcommittee that is chaired by Andrew Way at Health Canada. And we're going to have, it's going to end up being about 3 hours. It's going to be a meeting using open space technology, which is a methodology of running large group meetings designed to encourage innovative and creative problem-solving sessions. And it's particularly effective in situations where there's diverse perspectives and we're dealing with complex, controversial topics, right? So the theme of our open space technology meeting will be, what standards could we create for the cannabis industry to address regulatory concerns or needs? So that's the theme of our open space technology meeting. We hope a lot of people on this call will be able to join us for that. Another, joint subcommittee task group initiative that we're actually launching this January is going to be between the lab subcommittee and then our devices committee. And it's going to be on vape product safety. So we're going to work on developing test methods, guides, and best practices for aerosol and vapor analysis and characterization. So we hope that any experts on the call listening here today will join us for that. The processing subcommittee is going to be having a task group, and they've had, I think, 2 already, but we'll be continuing the discussion on having a specification standard for determining whether something is an intoxicating or non-intoxicating cannabinoid. So having metrics surrounding that. Particularly in the lab subcommittee, we'll also have task groups on certificates of analysis, so standards for that. Just like reading a label, I think it's important for businesses to be able to understand how to read a COA and have those be standardized in certain sections. And then also out of specifications for labs, having standardized procedures around that. And if anybody's interested on the hemp side, we actually have 5 different task groups this January on industrial hemp, which includes hemp fiber testing and hemp seed for animal feed. So there's a lot of hemp task groups going to be happening in January as well. So
great. Thank you for that breakdown. 2024 is going to be very exciting. Well, we are about 15 minutes out from hitting the hour mark, so I'd like to get into some of the Q&A questions. So from James asking about hemp companies, great segue. Hemp companies profiting from an unregulated industry are fighting any regulation and using the cannabis GRAS acceptance as cover for why they should be able to sell products. Hemp-derived intoxicating synthesized cannabinoids are not GRAS and actually contain potentially dangerous chemical byproducts that keeps us divided. David, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I think the reality is we're all fighting for something, and that goes back to my like we need to come together and get clarity on, no regulations just don't work. And I think there's an argument that's valid that like there are regulations, but are they adequate? Are they being enforced? Are they adopted? Which we'll kind of get to. I see a couple questions here later as well. And to use grass from a generally recognized as safe example, I want to encourage everybody here to think outside the box, or let's just throw the box away. Let's pretend the box doesn't exist, and the box that I'm talking about is like the established FDA framework. Most of us here on the call are in the United States, and that's what we know. But there's many other ways to keep 7 billion people, 8 billion, I've lost track, on our planet safe, reasonably safe, right? And so is grass the appropriate methodology or criteria? Well, we know it's not, because that only addresses limitations of food, edibles, ingested products. Grass has nothing to do with inhalable products, which is also a major part of the unregulated hemp industry. So I don't know if there's a clear question in there, but I think the point is, taken. It's a fact that there are potentially dangerous chemical byproducts. There's plenty of studies to support that. Potentially is an important point here. How dangerous is it? At what threshold? We need to discuss and identify these products, these chemicals first, and then we need to understand the toxicological and pharmacological risks associated with it, so that we can then put a framework together and say, yeah, you can have those impurities there, but at this level, or there's no acceptable level of these impurities. And until we start getting past this conversation of we need regulations, or we all support regulations, and get down to like the brass tacks of those details and what those mean, we're kind of spinning our wheels. And the implication is, the risk is that, again, Congress will see this as a major disaster, attorney generals or other people in power, and this will get completely shut down. And so we'll have no marketplace. This will be unregulated, prohibited products, and we'll be back to the prohibition dare era. So we have to do something. We have to have these hard conversations. We have to ask hard questions, collect the data, and make decisions.
Alena, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that David pointed out that, grass generally recognized as safe is a system for ingestibles, not inhalables. So if the, hemp and cannabis industry wants to use grass, we're going to need to develop a grass standard for inhalables, which is a large segment of our industry. So I just think that, to David's point, none of us can go in saying we don't want any regulation, and then the FDA is going to be like, yeah, that's cool, no regulation for you, just because you want it, right? So we are going to have some level of regulation. Now the question is whether you as a hemp company or a cannabis company is going to actually come to the table at a standards development organization and help us write those standards that ideally will be adopted by our regulatory agencies, as they have been in every other consumable industry.
Great. I'm glad we got to cover that. That's an important point. So many familiar faces jumping into our Q&A here. Carrie asks that at MJ Biz, a cannabis attorney told her that if rescheduling cannabis goes to Schedule 3 and that goes through, all products would need to be sold at a pharmacy rather than the current dispensary systems that we have. Do either of you have a take on that?
I can jump in if that's all right, Alena. There's a lot of confusion, rightfully so, because it's complicated. The statement that all products, if it's become Schedule 3, need to be sold at a pharmacy rather than a dispensary, could be argued as true with the strict interpretation that yes, Schedule 3 drugs are sold through pharmacies just like Schedule 2, 4, and 5, or actually, let me take that back. Any drug, unless it's an over-the-counter drug, right, has to be dispensed and sold through a pharmacy. And that also requires the drug to be an approved drug. So moving scheduled cannabis to Schedule 3 does not automatically make it an approved drug. And the other way to look at it is there's really no difference between the fact that today a Schedule 1 drug has no medically accepted value and has no place in commerce, period. And I'm pretty sure that's not what any of us see outside our doors throughout the 40 states that have medical programs. So in theory, that's not an incorrect statement if you read the interpretation of the law. But if you follow that, we don't have a 20 to $40 billion marketplace today with Schedule 1. So hopefully that kind of helps kind of dispel the complexity around it. Ultimately, again, it does create some uncertainty. There certainly will need to be some sort of like a Cole memo or guidance document created to give states confidence and operators confidence that the DEA or FDA is not going to all of a sudden say, now you're in violation of Schedule 3 and we're going to shut you down, the same way they're not going after folks that are in state regulated marketplaces with recognizing that it's a Schedule 1 drug. So there's nuance there. I'm not the expert, none of us are. I would tell you to call Shane or Andrew or track down. Actually, I'll try to find the post and put it in. But I think Shane really covered this well on one of his blog posts of why that's something that we should not be concerned about. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. I was curious about that myself. Another question here. Michigan's in the discussion phase of potentially implementing 21 CFR Part 117, Part A and B, with the possibility of Part C and beyond. Being as these are standards for manufacturing of human food, pure prediction, how do you envision they'll convert it to cannabis? Some of those standards don't translate one-to-one by just changing the word food to cannabis. That's a little over my head, so I'm going to let one of you take that.
I definitely have an answer, but I want to steal the thunder. Alena, do you have something you want to jump in on that first? Or
I mean, there has been, I think, a total of 19 states that have some sort of either recommendation or requirement to use some GMP from a different industry, food, dietary supplements, pharmaceuticals, and just some parts of them. I do think that, Part A and Part B really deal with very general stuff that I do think can apply mostly to cannabis. Once you get into those later subparts, it becomes more nuanced and more specific to food. And, it is a good point that we have such a diverse range of products. So if a state is going to adopt, just the food GMP, does that apply to inhalers and topicals and suppositories and smokables? Maybe not directly. So my answer to this would be, to please come to the table at ASTM so we can create these manufacturing standards and get those adopted rather than the CFR parts that are related to other industries. Let's create our own, so to speak, CFR part, in the ASTM process, and then later on that'll get adopted in, once we federally legalize.
Yeah, I struggle with this question because on the one hand, I want to say, Michigan, what are you doing? Why are you just trying to fit a round, peg in a square hole? But at the same time, I think as Alena mentioned, there's 18 states that have done something similar and for valid reasons, because we know GMPs are the best minimum standards. Like literally you break it down. What does it mean? Good, not great, not amazing, not mediocre, but good. Like we need good. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Manufacturing, this relates to production, and then practices. These are practices. These are not like rigid prescriptive things. These are high level practices and concepts. So I applaud Michigan for considering it, that because the absence of a better option. But to their point, it just doesn't work perfectly. And I think we've seen that struggle in the states that have adopted similar, whether it's 111, 117, 211, name your numbers, where now how do you enforce it? How do you interpret it? They're not experts. States are not born as experts in GMPs in general, let alone how to translate it. And so there is a great standard at ASTM that is, I think it just closed the second round or maybe third round of balloting, actually written by a consultant that spent 27 years at CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition within the FDA, wrote their first allergen program, worked on FSMA. So he took 117, 211 and 111 looked at the World Health Organization's good manufacturing practices for herbal medicines and put together a high-level principles document, because GMP is really just our principles at the end of the day. They're high-level principles that we can then carve out and address for cosmetics. There's a ISO standard for cosmetic GMPs, pills and tablets for, dietary supplements, ingestibles, and then last but not least, because that's almost half of our product category in cannabis, inhalables. So we do need to figure all that out. And I'm hopeful that folks will be able to use an ASTM standard that is fit for purpose for cannabis for GMPs as soon as that becomes available. So hopefully that answers the question. It really just, again, goes back to where I started with the first question answering, like, let's throw the box away and let's not be so rigid to one of the three product categories. We've got to be we're innovative. We're the cannabis industry. We should be able to be comfortable being innovative and not putting ourselves in these existing boxes.
That's great. These are all really wonderful questions. If anyone else in the audience here has them, please feel free to use the Q&A function here. There's another one that came in from the registration from the state of Tennessee, where there isn't a comprehensive medical cannabis program. So there's time to do it right and get industry standards into the legislation. Now you're thinking. So the question is, what kind of ASTM resources are available for state programs?
I can take that one as well, I guess. Here's try to make this a succinct answer. It's obviously an area we all feel passionate about. ASTM provides an amazing process. ASTM, when you think of as the company and the staff, they're not experts in cannabis, they're expert in standards. They hang out with nuclear and regulatory considerations, food, tires, playgrounds, trampolines, you name it. And we're all volunteers. Alena, myself, and the 700 folks are all volunteers. We pay our $115 to fill that gap and help the state of Tennessee and other regulators. I'm fortunate to have built a fairly great relationship with the CANRA folks. I'm a huge fan of them. To help them understand this process and navigate it is not easy. That's one of the main reasons why Alena is supporting me as co-founder in launching the S3 Collective as a nonprofit to help drive awareness and collect more data to have scientific information. That's first S, around to inform the development of standards. Second S, right? That can be used to protect consumers with adequate product safety guidelines, the third S. So our focus is to help folks understand, educate them on the process, educate them how to use these standards. It's not our idea, it's the process that has vetted this, and not just ASTM standards. Again, any entity that meets, is ANSI accredited, another acronym, for creating, voluntary consensus standards. We're there to help. So email us, reach out to us through GMP Collective or go to s3collective.org and submit your information on the contact us form. And we're happy to help you, the state of Tennessee, or anybody else that wants to dive into that.
Wonderful. It looks like there's another question that came in. Would you say that as a Schedule 1, there's no tools for going after state products, but when and if cannabis becomes Schedule 3, then there's a regulatory framework and agencies to enforce laws? And wouldn't all products then need to be FDA approved to be able to be sold? That's a great question.
It is a great question. It's another tough one because, and I don't know, Alena, jump in if you, go.
So just because there is a regulatory framework that exists for Schedule 3 doesn't mean that there's money and resources for enforcement. So that's a big, there isn't suddenly all this money that, FDA and other regulators have to, enforce, those laws and regulations. So I think it'll still be a lower priority to say that, everything's going to have to go through the pharmacy system. Right now we're operating, in Schedule 1, the most strict, schedule, and we don't see that happening. So I just don't see moving down the schedule as an impetus for the appropriations committees of Congress to get more funding for that enforcement effort.
Yeah, I'm putting 2 links in the chat for everybody. There's one botanical guidance for cannabis, and then it's a link somewhere in the second chat. Or sorry, the first one was for botanical guidance for drug development. Yes, if it were to be considered a drug, which that's the only accepted pathway today, that's going to require, whether it's a pharma company or a cannabis company, to invest at least $500 million to conduct the clinical trials. They've created guidance for how to go through that process as a botanical drug to have been approved, to my knowledge, in the last 25 years, and they added guidance for the FDA, or sorry, for cannabis. So yes, that's technically possible, but we know it's not realistic. That's not the $20 billion state marketplace. So we've got to, develop a framework that the FDA could regulate, or that states can, regulate as minimum standards. So hopefully that helps. I know it's a hot topic and it's a complicated one, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. I think it goes back to there is some uncertainty.
Great. This has been a great discussion. We are past the hour, but if anyone in the audience has any suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover in these webinars in 2024, I'd love to hear your feedback. Please shoot me an email at bethany@gmpcollective.com. So thank you, David and Alena, for an amazing webinar. Thank you to everyone who attended live and especially submitted questions. As a reminder, all past episodes can be found on the GMP Collective's website in case you missed one, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Absolutely get involved in ASTM Committee Week happening in Louisville, Kentucky during the week of January 21st, where the D37 Cannabis Committee will meet. Book your flights and hotels, get ready to roll up your sleeves with us. If you're interested in learning more about working with us, we offer strategic advising, subject matter expertise, data-driven solutions, and more, all designed to elevate your business operations. Secure success for your business now by visiting gmpcollective.com to schedule a consultation. And thank you all for joining us. We will see you next month.
Thank you all.